reviewing the data that you collect is a really good starting point.
So if you think about, for example, the recruitment process, CVs and application forms, how do you currently collect data? Is it just from application forms? Do you use, for example, job boards? You need to be thinking about and telling people where you get their data from, and thinking in particular about whether you need their permission for you to process their data. Do you need to ask for consent? Historically, businesses have predominantly relied on consent to process people's personal data, and actually going forward under GDPR, that's not necessarily going to be necessary or even appropriate.
There is a problem here, particularly in the HR and recruitment context, that there is an imbalance of power in the relationship between an employer and an employee or a job applicant. And if you say to someone, in order to be able to offer you a job, we need your consent to us processing your data, of course that individual is going to say yes, I give my consent because they want to get the job. So there's a bit of a problem there with being able to show that consent is freely given. Consent, it needs to be specific. So if someone's giving you their consent, it needs to be for a particular purpose. And also consent needs to be given in by way of an affirmative action. The individual has to opt in rather than opt out.
It's going to be a lot more difficult to rely on consent going forward, which is why I'm really sort of pushing this idea that if there is a different ground that applies, you're probably better off relying on one of those alternative grounds. So what are they? Well, the second one is that you can't perform a contract without it. That's the example I gave of needing to process your employees' bank details in order to pay them. It's necessary to comply with a legal obligation. So, for example, you need to process your employees' sickness absence data to be able to pay them SSP. That's a legal requirement on you. You are legally obliged to carry out right to work checks, for example. So you'll need candidates' passport or an NI card or something like that. And you could look to rely on this ground that I need to process this data to comply with a legal obligation that's on me. You need to be setting out in your privacy notice the reasons why you're processing people's data, the sort of motivations behind it. In certain circumstances, an individual can approach you as the data controller and say, "You've got data on me, and I want you to delete it. I want to be forgotten." And that's something that you need to be aware of, and have processes in place to be able to deal with that should you get that kind of request. If you are relying on an individual's consent to process their data, they will have the right under GDPR to withdraw consent. If you are processing their personal data on the grounds of your legitimate interest, they have the right to object to that in certain circumstances. And all these different rights need to be set out in your privacy notice.